some myths, we're going to talk about some legends, we're going to talk about some trolls. If you like what you hear tonight, you can reach me at wetrollinfo@gmail.com. This is me. You'll hear my, are we keeping the lights on?
Yeah, it's just the camera can't.
Oh, they can't see? Oh, okay. Well, so much for ambiance. Okay. Yes, so if you like what you see tonight and you want to hear more about any of my projects, you can reach out to me at wetrollinfo.com. For those of you who are watching from the live stream, thank you for tuning in. There is going to be a chance for you to participate tonight at home and here, so just keep that in mind. Before we get started, some thanks are in order. Thank you, Nordic Northwest, for hosting me, as always, as your resident troll expert. It's great to be invited back. I also want to dedicate this presentation tonight to the translators. Each time I do a presentation, I kind of think about who I want to thank, and right now I think it's a really important time to think about people who are translating in our community. Whether you're doing it in your job, if you're translating an IEP plan for parents and students, if you're translating on behalf of your parent in a doctor's office, or if you're just translating culturally in between two people who are having a really hard time understanding each other, this one goes out to the translators. I wouldn't be able to do this work without diving into the work of translation myself, and so I have a deep appreciation for it. So I have a lot of work about trolls. You do not need to read this. All you need to know is that there's a lot of time that I spend on this subject, and what you're going to hear about tonight comes from the early troll period. That's between 700 Common Era and 1500, or as I like to call, Troll Genesis, from the hammer to the cross. So this is actually a timeline of my series called Trolls, a Retrospective. It's sort of an episode by episode series that I can take pieces of and curate to an organization's liking. And tonight we're going to be talking just about myths from that early era. If you want to hear more, you can certainly request it with Nordic Northwest, or you can reach out to me to hear more. So we're going to begin at the beginning, Troll Genesis. Also, if this is too far away from you, I know it's light in here, and you want to get a better look, you are so welcome to come up and sit right up here on the floor. Here's our agenda. We're going to talk about, in the beginning, literally the creation of the world according to the Vikings. We're going to talk about the first troll encounter. We're going to talk about troll etymology, trolls as landscape. We're going to talk about kennings, do a chalkboard analysis. And then we're going to reach a crossroads where you will get to decide where this presentation goes to. There'll be one theme which will go in one direction and a theme that goes in another. And you get to decide. You get to decide. Also, you at home get to decide. But you don't get both. We don't have time for both. So let's center ourselves with a couple quotes for this experience. All exaggerations seem short. Not much is worse than trolls. Literate Nordic poet 1200. Also, the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, 2009. Let's start with how it all began. In the beginning, there was Ginnungagap, the great emptiness that stretched as far as there was space. And that void echoed with a deep and hollow silence. This chaos of perfect silence and darkness lay between the realm of elemental fire, Muspelheim in the south, and the realm of elemental ice, Niflheim in the north. Slowly, over years and years, frost from the icy mountains of Niflheim met the billowing flames of Muspelheim within the Gununga Gap. Amid the hissing and sputtering, the fire melted the ice, and the drops formed themselves into Ymir, the giant, and the first being in the universe. Ymir's skin rippled with muscles that showed his great strength and enormous size. Overjoyed by his own existence, Ymir let out a rumbling roar that echoed throughout the entire abyss. Perhaps this was the incident that inspired his namesake, the Screamer. Weary, he fell into a slumber, and while he slept, the flames from Muspelheim made him sweat. The sweat from his limbs and armpits leapt forth into being and formed the first generation of giants. Some were ugly, others beautiful, but none as mighty as their father Ymir. As the frost continued to melt, a celestial cow named Onhumla emerged from it. She nourished Ymir with her milk, and she in turn was nourished by salt licks in the ice mountains. Odhumla's lick slowly uncovered two more beings, Buri, the first of the Aesir tribe of gods. And then his wife was revealed, of whom the record does not name. They had a son, Bor, who was the first being to cross racial lines and married a giantess named Besla. And they begat 3 children, half giant and half god. Amongst them was Odin, who became chief of the gods. The creation story, as according to Norse mythology, takes a bloody turn here. For there was conflict between the gods and the giants, and depending on who you ask, one side threw the first rock, and then the other responded with force. Thus began the cosmic battle between gods and giants, which would create the world as we know it, and subsequently will also end the world in the final battle called Ragnarok. What we'll look at today is what happened between, starting with those initial primordial centuries and concluding with a defined mythical order. This is our origin story, as best as we are able to reflect it from the written record. There are gaps, though, big ones, some as big as Gununga Gap itself, metaphorically speaking. And the first gap that I want to address is the primary assumption of our understanding of good and evil, how it springs from gods versus giants. How was it determined from day one which race exemplified good deeds, good values, goodness, and the good guy? And which side we aspire to be like, the team we cheer for unconditionally? What conditions created that distinction? Throughout the Norse mythological canon and analyses by researchers, I have yet to find a satisfying explanation for why the giants were determined to have threatening intentions from the get-go, and why the gods, conversely, have always been offered the benefit of the doubt. They were both there at the beginning of life, and they were dependent on one another to progenerate, to create the next generation of cosmic beings. Because, even in those days, it's really weird to have sex with your sister. You get weird babies. You want healthy babies? Go check out your hot neighbor next door. So how do we go from two races emerging miraculously from the ice, greeting each other as bedfellows, intermarrying even? And then in a split second, cosmically speaking, the gods claiming the narrative for the point of view for all that follows. That is all stories that come from the latter moments of Genesis up until now. Which, speaking of stories, this raises a second assumption worth addressing. We must consider the role of beings who writes history, humans. You know how they say history is written by the winners? There's a conflict, And what emerges from it is a winning class and a losing class. And the winners, covetous of that gold, no matter by which means led to the ends, these winners will henceforth have far more resources to paint the narrative in a lens that favors their glory. Their story, losers be damned. But are gods and humans deserving of our unconditional trust when they narrate how it went down, and in turn persuade us of who was in the right and who was in the wrong? Please keep these questions in mind as we continue on this journey tonight. Before we continue, though, you may notice several binaries featured across the page, but there's one that's missing. Can you guess? It's why you're here. Trolls, of course. I will share with you tonight many examples of how the cosmic conflict of gods versus giants, good versus evil, eventually calcified into an earth-based model: humans versus trolls. So let's begin with the creation of Earth. The gods and the giants sparred, and by the end of each event, a stalemate existed. And with each passing battle, opportunities for coalition and coexistence were lost. Odin and his brothers, Vili and Ve, were determined to eradicate the race of giants. And so it was that they decided to focus their ire on the Great Father, the Great Emir. Ooh. Not much is known today about how they found Ymir in such a compromising position, alone and vulnerable. But in any case, the brothers were successful in their campaign. They slew Ymir by climbing on top of him and hacking his body to pieces. Perhaps this was the incident that inspired his namesake, the Screamer. A tremendous flood of Ymir's blood burst forth, covering the cosmos and drowning all the giants within. The brothers dragged his corpse into the center of Ginnungagap and set to work creating the earth. They fashioned the oceans from his blood, the soil from his skin and muscles, vegetation from his hair, clouds from his brain, and the sky from his skull. They saved his brow for one final construction, to build a wall on the edge of a new land called Midgard. There, the three brothers had invented a marvelous new creature, a pair to be exact. These were man and woman, Ask and Embla. And they'd been fashioned from two Ymirian tree trunks on the edge of some Ymirian sea. Each brother gave the humans a gift. I think at this point they were feeling pretty satisfied with themselves, and they wanted to celebrate in style. Odin gave the humans the breath of life. Vili gave them movement and intelligence, and Ve gave them their senses and shape. In Midgard, the humans multiplied. Take a moment to check out this map. I'm going to pause my narration. It's pretty complicated. This is the universe according to the Norse. We'll continue. In Midgard, humans flourished and found abundance in the rich Emirian soil, replenished from dewy skies, and safety so long as they stuck within the boundaries of their own cultivation. As generations passed, the growth of the primordial beginnings diminished around them. When a tree is fashioned into a table, and time passes, that table loses connection to the wild breathing vegetation it once was. It forgets where it comes from. And so it was with the humans who listened to the narrative spun by the gods and adhered to the conditions of life, to heed the borders of civilization, lest ye be confronted with monsters from the primordial past, wild things that somehow survived the destruction of the initial universe, giants which lived in Jotunheim, for example. It was within this society that humans came to associate fear with courage, and proving oneself by slaying the enemies of the gods was the way to live, as it was the only way to die. Dying a natural death was deemed dishonorable, in fact, and your afterlife experience would be far more frightening than anything you'd experience while alive. This meant the only way to die was to be slain in battle. Odin and his brethren led by example, after all. So, to succeed was to destroy. 'Twas the way of the Vikings. And that meant meeting your fears head on somewhere out there past the boundaries into the thick wood, where those ancient minerals still quivered and shook, where the wild things still lived, and your human sensibilities might not save you. You must go. Yes, to save your soul, you must go out there. You must prove that you are worthy. You must find an adversary. You could look for trolls. And so it was that men and women ventured out into the far-flung expanses of Midgard, seeking to discover, seeking to win in control of one's destiny. Ah, yes, the wild wonders of the trees and mountains exciting the senses, leading you further and deeper, and suddenly you don't know where you are. You've lost grasp of reality, and you stumble further into the wood, and each passing stone has eyes on you. And oh my God, is they out there? Are they gonna get me? Is this my moment? Is death here? Will I make it to Valhalla? And suddenly, something in front of you reaches out and says, hello. This is the first encounter with a troll. They call me troll, gnar of the moon, wealth sucker of the giant, Cirrus's friendly companion, night roaming hag, swallower of the wheel of heaven. What is a troll but that? What is a troll but that? Don't you know? Oh no, that's what I'm here. Sorry. Okay. According to Scandinavian historian John Lindau, trolls enter the literary record in verses attributed to Viking Age poets. But even at this first moment, they are challenging and striking. We first hear from a troll rather than of a troll. Notice that distinction. There's much to discuss about this content. I know how intimidating this can be, right? And we're going to analyze it quite a bit. So just let this kind of wash over you in the next couple of slides. So let's look up the word troll itself to get some context clues. In the book Trolls: An Unnatural History, Lindau says, when we investigate the meaning of a word, we frequently and naturally ask ourselves what it originally meant. However, trolls have kept their secret. We still do not know the origin of the word troll. Guesses include derivation from such verbs as tread, to rush away angrily, roll as with a ball of lightning, and enchant, as well as from a noun meaning stout person. While we can perhaps conjure up images of trolls to which any of the above might be applied, I incline towards an origin related to magic, especially shifting and changing things. If nothing else, this explanation agrees with the lexical situation. Like trolls themselves, the word seems to have been capable of shape and even gender shifting. Remember this bit about gender shifting. I'm going to show you something in the next couple of slides. Observe the word troll in the various Nordic languages. In Old Norse, you have troll and troll. And the verb trulla, as in turn something or someone into a troll. And then you have Icelandic, Faroese, Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian. All variations. See how there's an asterisk on the Danish word trolled? The Danish variation of the word troll has a gender shifting distinction that the other versions lack. Here's what I mean. The Danish trolled is common gender, not neuter gender like all the other ones. Common gender nouns are nouns that are used for both males and females. Neuter gender nouns are words for things that are not alive. According to Lindau, the Danish common gender presumably has something to do with the sense that neuter gender is inappropriate for beings with human form. So although we don't yet know what the first troll looked like, there is an indication from the Danish that trolls have physically more in common with humans than not. Speaking of gender, according to the Skaldic Project, there are both masculine and feminine usages of troll within the poem They Call Me Troll. But given some sexualized references, which we will talk about later, I am inclined to believe that the troll who talked to the person in the woods is of the feminine sort. So henceforth, I'm going to refer to her as a femtroll. I made up this word. Okay. So that dictionary exercise wasn't super helpful. Gives us a little bit more about the word. We've now selected a gender for this exercise. But we can look for some more context clues within this poem. Who was on the receiving end of this poem? That guy. The troll in question had a verse exchange with Bragi the Old, image right. Bragi was the first named poet in the North, credited with the creation of the verse form that Viking Age poets and their descendants in Iceland used for centuries. This Bragi appears in many sources, including Eric Small, a 10th century poem describing the entry of the vanquished king Eric Bloodaxe into Valhalla. And when Odin, the head of the gods, is gathering up heroes for the last battle against the forces of chaos and evil, Bragi stands alongside these heroes. A few centuries later, medieval antiquarians appear to have lost the distinction between these heroes and the gods themselves. And so they conceived of Bragi as the god of poetry, and often as music as well, which is why he's featured here with a harp. It is therefore significant that the troll was speaking to Bragi. Now we know a little bit more about him. Let's consider the conditions of the exchange. Bragi the Old was walking through a forest late at night at some time during the late 9th century. Some ecological context to consider: this forest by its very nature is at some distance from human habitation, perhaps a considerable distance. And depending on the season, late at night in Norway could be dark, semi-dark, or even reasonably light if it was in the far north. Either way, Bragi suggests that he has entered the troll's domain. We are outside Midgard at this point. Most likely in modern-day Norway. Perhaps one of these places. These are on the relative outskirts of human habitation. And they're actually named after trolls. Top left is Trollvegen, Troll's Wall. Bottom left, Trollstigen, Troll's Path. Top right is Trollfjorden, Troll's Fjord. And bottom right, Trolltunga, Troll's Tongue. In the book The Migratory Legends by Reidar Arthur Christensen, the author makes a note about the role that setting plays in stories about encounters with trolls. He writes, Norwegian legends in which the trolls play a part are usually connected with some local landmark, such as an isolated boulder or stone, steep valleys and creeks, striking formations of hills, etc., all explained as being caused by the activities of trolls in former days. Such cliff formations are said to be trolls that have been turned to stone. So perhaps our first troll encounter happened one of these. Maybe that troll turned into one of these. Who knows? Okay. So we have a relative hypothesis about who was there, maybe where it was, maybe when it was. But we still don't know what the troll is saying. So we're now going to take a deeper look at the text. You may have noticed a little bit about this poem that there is a figurative way that language is spoken by the troll. Okay? In the second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth line. These are called kennings. A kenning is a metaphorical device that is unique to Old Norse poetry. It's a figure of speech that employs compound figurative language in place of a more concrete single word noun. What does that mean? This is what that means. Trying to understand a kenning is like the following scenario. You meet with your friend for a walk, and you can tell from their body language that something's going on. So you ask them, how's it going? And this friend wants to explain to you how they feel. But instead of explaining to you exactly what's going on in the present moment, they don't use concrete language. They instead say, well, this reminds me of something that happened a couple of years ago. And the circumstances were this, and it made me feel like that. And there was all these other things that were happening then too, like this and that and this and that. And there's all these other factors that are happening around the world right now that I just don't understand. And you're just like, but what does that have to do with my question? How's it going? And they say, because what happened then reminds me about what's happening right now. And this can be that moment where interpersonal communication really hits the fan. Because you're like, I just wanted an answer to my question, you know? Like, could you just say, like, I feel sad, or I'm upset, or I feel good, or whatever? You know, this is just really confusing. I know that you've experienced this before, right? You love your friends' stories, but you just don't have the time. So this process is called circumlocution. It's a phrase or phrases that circle around a specific idea with multiple words rather than directly evoking it with fewer and apter words. It's roundabout and it's indirect. It leaves a gaping hole for interpretation on the part of the receiver, that is, the listener or reader, which is us. But fear not. We are going to do the work of interpreting these kennings together. So if you're lost already, don't worry. This blackboard is going to keep track of our brainstorm easily, so you can just follow along and relax. There is not going to be a test at the end. despite the fact that there is a blackboard up here. I know some of you have very bad memories of blackboards. This is just an image. You are not in 3rd grade. Let's go. Okay. First of all, something to keep in mind when we are interpreting kennings is that they are frequently unintelligible without understanding of myth and stories from way back when. They're going to refer to context that you might not understand offhand. So I'm going to do that work of giving you that mythic knowledge along the way. Here we go. Here are 2 translations of They Call Me Troll, taken from the original source, the Edda, written in Old Norse by Snorri Sturluson around 1220 CE in Iceland. We'll discuss who that guy is later. For now, take a minute to look at these 2 translations. Just a minute. Okay. We're going to start with line 7. And they're color-coded so you can keep track. From a mythological perspective, the only clear kenning here is line 7. Swallower of heaven wheel. Can anyone guess what heaven wheel is? Yes. Yes. Heaven wheel is referring to the sun or the moon. And this is not a good sign, because in Norse mythology, during Ragnarok, the end of the world, a gigantic wolf named Fenrir will destroy the world by swallowing the sun or the moon. The term is used interchangeably for either, and each are of equal importance to the survival of humanity. If there is no sun, there is no daylight. No daylight, no crops. No crops, no food, we all die. In the case of the moon being swallowed, if this happens, we can't tell time. We don't know when to plant, to harvest, we starve, we die. Either way, sun or moon, swallower of heaven wheel, is a cosmic threat. And anyone living at that time, literate or not, can recognize this as a threat. So, not good. And that's the one kenning that we can only clearly decipher by using mythical resources. The other ones are quite opaque. So here's the well-meaning guesswork on the remaining ones. Line 3, giant's wealth sucker, could be referring to the troll undermining the strength of giants through some insidious sucking mechanism, like a leech attaching itself to one's ankle under boggy circumstances. Since we know from an earlier in the presentation that giants are the primary antagonists of the gods, a troll sucking their resources might not be such a bad idea. So maybe trolls aren't such a threat to humans after all. It's good news for Odin, and humans like Odin. So maybe the troll is not so bad. But if we break down this kenning into its smaller parts, we go from giant's wealth to wealth of the giant, which could refer to gold. Giants covet and hoard gold, so do trolls. According to the Skaldic project, although the reference to what exactly the wealth is obscure, we're overlooking a more tantalizing obscurity. There could be an element of competition for the gold here, between the giant and the troll, that the femme troll speaker could actually somehow suck out the gold from the mouth of the giant. And when I say suck it out of its mouth, you have to think about what kind of circumstance would happen for the troll to get close enough to the giant to do so. If you catch my drift, there's an oral element, wink, wink. So, or the troll would rob the giant by some other means. Yeah. Given also that we are talking about sucking, this oral element finds its counterpart in line 7. We just talked about swallower of heaven wheel. So there's a lot of mouth-related bits here. Yeah. In fact, the troll may suck wealth from giants, but there's also evidence in this poem that trolls identify with giants as well. Perhaps solidarity between the two twin antagonists can be found. The troll invokes the name Hrungnir, who was a famed giant that, the story goes, was invited by Odin to a horse race from Jotunheim, the land of the giants. Upward they rode their horses, Hrungnir and Odin side by side, all the way to, as line 2 references, the dwelling of the moon, which is another term for, as line 4 references, the bale of the storm hall. Both of these two kennings simply mean the sky. They rode to the sky, to Asgard, the land of the gods. Odin won, and it certainly helped that his horse Sleipnir had 8 legs. Odin wasn't a poor sport though, because to celebrate, he offered Hrungnir complimentary mead on the house. Several pints later, the other gods, the Aesir, grew weary of this giant's presence in their kingdom. This other, drinking their mead and making stupid jokes in their space. So they killed him. They killed him for staying at the bar after last call. Well, technically, this is where I'm supposed to introduce you to someone else. The man who laid the hammer down. Maybe you've met him before. Wait, let me just make some adjustments so you can recognize him. There we go. This is Thor, god of thunder, and the world's most famous redhead. In time, Thor will become known for other idiosyncrasies. For one, he will develop a specialty slaying style. And no, I'm not just talking about his method, his hammer, his Mjolnir. I'm speaking to a homicidal forte towards one particular target. Trolls. Thor kills troll after troll after troll. Just look at this statement that's found over and over again across the Edda. Thor had gone eastward to crush trolls. This story will, or the statement will just open a story, like in media res. It doesn't explain why, just that he has come back because he has finished vanquishing trolls. We just know that he's hell-bent on doing it. So perhaps this is why the troll refers to herself in line 6 as the guardian of the corpse fjord. Break it down, corpse fjord means graveyard. Of human bodies or troll bodies, however you think of it, this troll knows death intimately. So back to Bragi and that 9th century Norwegian wood, if we put all the pieces together from our chalkboard analysis, even if it doesn't form a perfect picture, to this human, trolls represent a threat to the cosmos, are destroyers of prosperity, associates of giants, and associated with death. Perhaps if you were Bragi at this moment, receiving these statements from a creature newly discovered after you had just taken a walk in the woods, well, technically she found you, not the other way around. it would be reasonable to be very scared and having a complete existential crisis if you were Bragi. But the thing is, as far as we know, Bragi did not write this poem. The Vikings were not literate folks. An argument could be made that runes are evidence of writing, sort of, but they were a type to pass down stories orally. And they passed down those stories generation after generation after generation, but the first time that the stories were actually committed to writing in a book wasn't until 1220 in Iceland by this guy. Wait. This guy. Snorri Sturluson. Snorri was a medieval Icelandic historian, poet, and politician who was born in 1179 Common Era. He was elected twice as law speaker of the Icelandic parliament and, unfortunately, was assassinated in 1241 by men claiming to be agents of the King of Norway. But that is where we end talking about his political career, because what we are most interested in is what he authored. Beginning with one, the Edda. Sometimes referred to as the Prose Edda, this text, written around 1220, is the major source for everything that we know today about Old Norse mythology. I wish I could call it a primary source. I wish I could say that Snorri was there, that he was a believer in the mythology, but he wasn't. Snorri lived in Iceland during a time that was on the latter end of religious conversion to Christianity, which began around 1000 Common Era. Snorri was not a pagan. He didn't believe in this stuff. He was literate, which the Vikings were not. Side note. Oh, wait, I already said that side note. We continue. So, it's important that we consider the non-primary source lens that Snorri embodied when we do this work of uncovering the authentic Nordic past. Because later folklorists, one as famous as Jacob Grimm, in fact, would make the mistake of reading the Edda as, from his own words, a purer authority for the Norse religion that's been preserved for us, the readers of the future. Comparative literature professor Randy Eldovik explains this further in his essay, Less Than Kind, Giants in the Germanic Tradition. He writes, "We now realize more clearly than in Grimm's time how much Eddic prose and Eddic poetry are the products of writers affected by an education that was both Christian and, within medieval limitations, classical. Classical meaning Latin and Greek. If Eddic lays had been composed orally before Christianization of Scandinavia, still they were committed to writing only after Christian conversion, with who knows what changes in the process. The conclusions made within the prose narratives of Snorri Sturluson, a highly educated man of the 13th century, took shape in circumstances remote from authentic Norse paganism. To summarize, Snorri was an educated man for his time, and we should assume that influences from both the Christian religion and classical, Latin and Greek mythology, can be found in his writing about Old Norse mythology. Back to the chalkboard. This process is called syncretism. The merging or assimilation of several originally discrete traditions, especially in the theology and mythology of religion. This asserts an underlying unity between two or more different forms or beliefs of practice. To break it down, you take one worldview from one religion and add another worldview from a different religion, and then you add it to a pot and mix it, and you pour it out, and you publish it. So let's take a look at how something like this impacts a story that I've already shared with you today. Remember Hrungnir. He was the giant that our first recorded troll invoked. As you know, he was invited by Odin to a horse race from Jotunheim, the land of the giants, to Asgard, the land of the gods. Odin won, offered Hrungnir a few pints to celebrate, and the day ended in infamy when Thor laid down his hammer and Hrungnir was dead. So, let's take a look at this story through the lens of classical, ancient Greece. I'm going to let you look at this for 30 seconds. Okay. In Greek mythology, gigantes were a race of giants born of divine stock and lived primarily in the land of Thrace. Gigantes were excluded from Mount Olympus, where the gods, the Olympians, lived, because a big battle many eons prior had determined the cosmic order of things. The gods were on top of the mountain, and the gigantes were solidified as part of the enemy class below. Occasional outbreaks of hostilities in which the gigantic beings tried to seize the celestial realm from which they had been excluded occurred, but although they had reason to begrudge Zeus's occupation of Mount Olympus, their hostility was not absolute. Some of them would aid the Olympians from time to time. There was also a certain amount of amicable social relations between the Olympians and these various gigantic beings. There were intermittent incidents of mutual aid and indeed friendly and family dealings. Sometimes a lack of any hard and fast distinction between the divine beings and their exiled gigantic kin existed, except for one rule: who was allowed inside the home? When it came to Mount Olympus, it was for Olympians only. Think about the parallels with Norse mythology. Think about Hrungnir. He and Odin had a good time, all right, but boy, was it a costly mistake to pass the threshold of Asgard's gates for a couple of pints. The Aesir were having none of that, even if the big guy invited an exception. Maybe they thought he'd try to take over the place? Hrungnir was murdered because he was in the wrong realm. So what accounts for these similarities between the Old Norse and ancient Greek? Syncretism? Or parallel but independent thought processes? I'm inclined to agree with the former, and there are further echoes across the Edda of other classical traditions and Christian ones as well. All right, we've reached the point of our presentation where we have a crossroads. I have so much I'd love to share with you, but alas, we have only limited time together today. So, up until this point, you have learned about the origin story of the Norse universe, the first beings to determine the cosmic order, some exceptions to the rule, some not exceptions to the rule, and a big heaping of syncretic salt. So we're going to venture deeper into the Edda and talk about some stories about trolls. You are ready for this moment, but you have a decision to make. What kind of stories do you want to hear? Theme number 1, sex, gender, revenge. Or theme number 2, labor, tricksters, pay me. For those of you at home, You have 1 minute to write into the chat which theme you want. Your minute starts now. For those of you here, you have 30 seconds to think about what you want to vote for. And then I'm going to do a call of hands. We're going to tally everything together, and the most votes win. All right, room folks. If you want theme number 1, raise your hand. You counting, Michael? Okay. If you want theme number 2, raise your hand. Oh, it's in the room. It's split. I'm kind of nice.
With the online votes, theme 2 wins.
Theme 2. Okay, here we go. Theme 2. What was the numbers? Curious. Was it close? 50-50? 55-45?
It was about, online it was about 70%.
Really? Oh, okay. Nice. All right. Yes, it should be. Do you see it? It's towards the. I know. You're going to have to slide down. There's going to be a slide that has a big brown block that says theme 2. Got it? All right, theme 2. Okay. So, let's do this. Now that we have a better understanding of how the syncretic process informed Snorri's writing on the complex relationships between giants and the Old Norse gods, we know that the giants are largely marginalized, occasionally acceptable to the gods as mates and helpers, but prohibited from entering Asgard, lest ye end up like Hrungnir. It is this homicidal fixation by the Aesir of keeping giants away from the homestead that makes our next story all the more strange, because in fact, they strike a deal with one to install a home security system. This is the story, or rather 2 variations of the same story, a myth versus a legend, that beautifully demonstrates how giants' relationships with the gods is analogous to trolls' relationships with humans. But first, a soapbox side note from me. These are also the stories that represent a pivotal moment in my career writing about this. It's when I realized that I could evolve with this work, and that writing about trolls from a nonfiction perspective was not a static exercise. This is really important, and I'm saying this to any one of you who is a writer or an artist. This is me speaking directly to you. Here's what I realized. You do not have to keep every draft. You do not have to commit to every premise. You can change your mind about something after you've written it. even after it's been published. So long as you are willing to own up to your audience, as long as you say why you changed your mind, and you do so with reference and courage and conviction and humility, then the possibilities of growing with this work are truly limitless. And that is the ecosystem of sustainability as a writer and an artist, is allowing yourself to change. So I'm going to step off my soapbox now because I have really amped up the expectations for these stories. Okay, back to the show. These stories tell of a talented builder who showed up to a work site and saw that the foreman of the operation needed some help. And the builder had just the particular set of skills that the foreman needed. The builder knew his worth too. He set his price. Hands were shook and the work began. The first story is the myth of the builder, which occurred sometime when the Norse gods were building their palace in Asgard. And the first recorded, well, it was recorded in Snorri's Edda, as you know by now. You'll hear more about the second one afterwards. For now, you're in for a treat, because we're going to watch a little video. Where's the video? Yes, okay. Ooh. Yeah, there's the video. Okay, I do not own the rights to this video. Here we go. Do I have to click it? No? No? Okay, cool.
Skandinavia, a realm of wonders, was where the Norse gods made their home. There, Othin's great hall of Valagor towered above the mountains, and Bifrost, the rainbow bridge, anchored itself. But though their domain was magnificent, it stood undefended from the giants and trolls of Jotunheim, who despised the gods and sought to destroy them. One day, when Thor, strongest of the gods, was off fighting these foes, a stranger appeared, riding a powerful gray horse. The visitor made the gods an astonishing offer. He would build them the greatest wall they'd ever seen, higher than any giant could climb, and stronger than any troll could break. All he asked in return was the beautiful goddess Froya's hand in marriage, along with the sun and moon from the sky. The gods balked at this request and were ready to send him away, but the trickster Loki concocted a devious plan. He told the gods they should accept the stranger's offer, but set such strict conditions that he would fail to complete the wall in time. That way, they would lose nothing, while getting most of the wall built for free. Froya didn't like this idea at all, but Othin and the other gods were convinced and came to an agreement with the builder. He would only have 1 winter to complete the wall. If any part was unfinished by the first day of summer, he would receive no payment, and he could have no help from any other people. The gods sealed the deal with solemn oaths and swore the mason would come to no harm in Oskander. In the morning, the stranger began to dig the foundations at an astonishing speed, and at nightfall he set off towards the mountains to obtain the building stones. But it was only the next morning, when they saw him returning, that the gods began to worry. As agreed, no other people were helping the mason, but his horse Svadilbody was hauling a load of stones so massive it left trenches in the ground behind them. Winter came and went. The stranger kept building. Svadilbody kept hauling, and neither snow nor rain could slow their progress. With only 3 days left until summer, the walls stood high and impenetrable, with only the gate left to be built. Horrified, the gods realized that not only would they lose their fertility goddess forever, but without the sun and moon, the world would be plunged into eternal darkness. They wondered why they'd made such a foolish wager, and then remembered Loki and his terrible advice. Suddenly, Loki didn't feel so clever. All of his fellow gods threatened him with an unimaginably painful death if he didn't find some way to prevent the builder from getting his payment. So Loki promised to take care of the situation and dashed away. Outside, night had fallen, and the builder prepared to set off to retrieve the final load of stones. But just as he called Svadilfari to him, a mare appeared in the field. She was so beautiful that Svadilfari ignored his master and broke free of his reins. The mason tried to catch him, but the mare ran deep into the woods, and Svadilfari followed. The stranger was furious. He knew that the gods were behind this and confronted them, no longer as a mild-mannered mason, but in his true form, as a terrifying mountain giant. This was a big mistake. Thor had just returned to Osgarth, and now that the gods knew a giant was in their midst, they disregarded their oaths. The only payment the builder would receive, and the last thing he would ever see, was the swing of Thor's mighty hammer, Mjolnir. As they set the final stones into the wall, the gods celebrated their victory. Loki was not among them, however. Several months would pass before he finally returned, followed by a beautiful gray foal with 8 legs. The foal would grow into a magnificent steed named Sleipnir and become Othin's mount, a horse that could outrun the wind itself. But exactly where he had come from was something Loki preferred not to discuss. How did Thor get his mighty Mjolnir? Trace the legend of his hammer with this video.
I hope you enjoyed that. By the way, that last bit that didn't quite tell you how Loki procured the horse, I looked it up. It turns out that Loki gave birth to the horse. He impersonated a horse himself because he's a shapeshifter, and that is how he was able to get the builder's horse to wander astray. And then they ended up having a horse together. You know. Yeah, he's a real piece of work, and it wasn't totally fair, but we'll get into that later. So now that you know the myth of the builder, we're going to talk about the legend of the builder. This story takes place around the time of the erection of the Lund Cathedral in 1123, Lund, Sweden, which at the time was Denmark. The first known recording of the legend was in 1654 by a man named Jens Lauritsen Wolff in his Encomion Renier Danier. As you listen to this version from John Lindau's Trolls and Unnatural History, you will notice some syncretic connections with the myth. Feel free to read along if you'd like, but by no means are you obliged. Here we go. This is the contextual preface, not the legend, just some context. As demons, trolls were naturally overcome by holy men and saints. In Lund, Sweden, we can actually see what may be a troll in the crypt of the cathedral. Built as the cathedral for the archdiocese of all Scandinavia and consecrated in 1123, the structure has of course been altered over time, but the crypt is thought to date from the inception of the cathedral. In the crypt are numerous piers, among them one of a figure clutching the pillar, and near it a woman. As early as 1593, a visitor noted these figures in his diary and added that people thought they were giants opposed to building the church on the spot. Not quite 60 years later, in his Encomion Renier Danier, Jens Lauritsen Wolff recorded the first version of this legend that has become attached to these figures. Saint Lawrence, the Roman deacon, whose cult maintains that he was roasted on a gridiron, and to whom the cathedral was dedicated, is here in what was then Denmark, trying to hurry along the building. End of context. Now, the legend itself. It is said that a troll came to St. Lawrence and offered to finish the church quickly, with the condition that St. Lawrence was to address the troll by name. And if he could not do that, he was to give him the sun and the moon. And if St. Lawrence could not do that, then the troll was to poke out St. Lawrence's eyes. And St. Lawrence agreed to that too. But what happened? The troll took no rest and built the church quickly. And when St. Lawrence saw that, he was greatly downcast. In great sorrow, St. Lawrence went out of Lund and was wandering. And from wandering and oppressive thoughts, he became tired and weary. And eventually, he lay down beside a mound to rest. And while he was resting, he heard the troll children howling and weeping, at which the troll mother, who was inside the mound, spoke to one of the children thus: "Be still, my son. Your father Finn will come and bring you the sun and moon to play with, or both of St. Lawrence's eyes." The troll stopped before St. Lawrence and demanded his payment and wages for his work, to which St. Lawrence responded, "Believe me, Finn, I will give you no payment until the church is finished." When the troll heard that word, Finn, with which St. Lawrence had named him by name, then he grew so angry and ferocious that he grabbed a pillar with both arms and wanted to pull down the entire church, which St. Lawrence forbade him through the power of him who is greater and more powerful than the troll. After that, the troll and troll wife and children remained at the pillars, where they can be seen today. Right there. So, the story of the builder, the myth and the legend, continues to inspire me to make new discoveries. As a former English teacher, I used various critical lenses in my classroom when working with students to investigate characters, plot, themes. And you've probably heard me use this word already, lens. Basically, using critical lenses on a story is like having a toolbox full of magnifying glasses. When you look at the same thing twice, you see different things because the lenses are different. So we're going to look at this through two different lenses. When I first came across this story, I can tell you that my sympathies were not with the builder. Years ago, I used to delight in the trickster moves played by Loki and St. Lawrence. They were clever in the bargain that they struck. They ensured that the fine print within the contract would not only deliver the product that they ordered, but one hell of a deal as well. They fooled this big, bumbling builder into forsaking his own payment through the art of the deal. What an idiot. He hadn't protected himself. He literally walked into enemy territory, knowing full well that he wasn't welcome. And he signed on the dotted line. Why? Weren't there opportunities elsewhere? Maybe with his own kind? It's like he asked for it. To be honest, this builder sounded like uneducated, backwoods troll trash. My sympathies were not with him. But that changed because I changed. And now I tend to look at this story through a Marxist lens. This is the story of a worker who endeavored to gain favor with the ruling class in hopes of maybe one day becoming their equal. Or minimally, that both signatures on the contract were of equal weight, that the foreman's word was in good faith, that when the builder showed up with a specialized skill which no one else could have provided, that alone established their value in their labor. Dignified labor. But because the ruling class only cares about their bottom line, which is to hoard wealth and share of it as little as possible with the 99% below, in this story, the Aesir and St. Lawrence used their infinite resources, cleverness, and connections to undermine the very bargain that they struck. It was very clever. And in the end, in both cases, the ruling class received a beautifully constructed monument, literally built atop the bones of the worker, without paying a dime. Doesn't that sound like a story you've heard before? And so I say to the Aesir and to St. Lawrence and to the ruling class, on behalf of the builder and workers everywhere, for the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. Audre Lorde. On that note, I'd like to conclude my presentation by taking a moment to revisit the exchange between Bragi the Old and the first troll. There is a tendency by some academics to study this exchange between the two parties as if it were a conflict. And some findings have concluded that Bragi wins because the troll introduces herself and then Bragi responds by introducing himself. He begins by saying, "They call me poet," and then he explains his identity in verse. And it employs more rhymes, more flourishes that you would come to expect from, indeed, a poet. And so when some academics suggest that Bragi wins this exchange, it is strange to me. And I say this because the arguments in favor of Team Bragi is that his poetry is more powerful than the troll's because there is simply more of it to read. More of Bragi's words, more of Bragi's perspectives, more Bragi across the Edda than the trolls or of any supernatural being. In the whole grand historium of early Nordic culture, he is on the home team with the gods, with the humans. His lens is favored and his creed is the one with the quill and the ink. But I challenge this notion because at this period in history when the Edda was composed, it was a written record that reflected the values of the literate ruling class. And we must always remember when looking backwards that history is written by the winners. In the Edda and the Norse canon, John Lindau tells us there are only a few verses from the point of view of any supernatural beings, but thousands from humans. So we must consider that always in this work where the narrative urges us to pick sides between heroes and villains, geniuses and fools. And I invite you to break down these assumptions, your assumptions, about which character is worthy of empathy, of trust, and which is not, of whose voice is represented in the text, who is telling the story, and who is not. And what does that mean for us who are listening? Thank you. You can find me here. You're free to go. Any questions? Thank you for coming. There's another talk happening next Tuesday, and then that one is going to be on trolls in conflict art as seen through art and literature. We live in a high conflict time right now in our country and abroad, and there are artists and writers who have actually used trolls as a motif to express themselves during times of conflict, to deliver themselves through grief. Artists like J.R.R. Tolkien, artists like Tove Jansson, and so that presentation talks about that. And then the third one on the 25th is in conjunction with 200 years of Norwegian immigration to the US. Talks about Norwegians coming over the seas and trolls hanging onto the boats with them, settling in small towns across America. And so you get to see some of these small towns in the Midwest, in the Pacific Northwest and beyond, and how trolls have carved their way into the heartland. So Thank you.
Thank you.